My name is Amelia. I'm 35, and today I buried my husband overseas. Even saying those words feels unreal, like they belong to someone else's story, not mine. After more than 30 sleepless hours, I boarded the plane home, clutching the last of his belongings like fragile pieces of a dream that had been ripped apart. By the time I landed, I was so drained that even my fingers trembled when I typed into the family group chat. Flight lands at 5:00 p.m. Can someone pick me up? It was such a small thing to ask, wasn't it? Just a ride home after the hardest days of my life. My brother Troy replied first. We're busy. Try Uber. Then my mother added, Why didn't you plan better? My throat tightened. My fingers hovered above the screen before I finally typed, No worries. But inside I was collapsing. I had no idea that within hours my family would be watching my tragedy unfold on the evening news. Before all of this, before grief tore through my life, I had what many would have called a picture-perfect life. James and I had met in college. He was the boy who spilled coffee on my economics textbook and insisted on buying me a new one. That clumsy disaster somehow turned into dinner, and dinner turned into years of laughter, love, and dreams. We married after graduation, built a home in Portland, and built a life that felt steady and safe. I worked as a marketing director. James thrived as a software engineer. We had a cozy 2-story house with a garden that I adored. James always teased me about my tomatoes, saying they could win state fair ribbons. We traveled whenever we could, spent Thursday nights playing board games with friends, and talked often about the future, saving for the day we'd turn the spare bedroom into a nursery. When James was offered a 6-month contract in Singapore, we were both excited. It felt like the kind of adventure that would make our marriage stronger. I planned to work remotely for part of the time so we could experience it together. The night before he left, we had dinner by candlelight, and he promised me that 6 months would fly by. His fingers intertwined with mine as he said, This will make our future even brighter. And at first it did. We video called every day. I visited him for 3 weeks around the holidays, and it felt like a second honeymoon. We wandered the city, tasted foods we'd never tried before, and even whispered about trying for a baby when his contract ended. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Until the morning everything changed. James had complained of a headache on one of our calls. It's probably stress, he said, rubbing his temples. 8 hours later, I got the call no wife should ever receive. He had collapsed in a meeting. A brain aneurysm, emergency surgery. By the time I got on the first available flight and reached Singapore 26 hours later, he was already in a coma. For 5 days I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand, whispering prayers into the silence, begging him to come back. But James never opened his eyes again. He was only 37. What followed was a nightmare I could never have imagined. Navigating a foreign hospital system alone, filling out endless paperwork, trying to understand legal processes through translation apps. I called my family constantly, desperate for comfort, but their responses were always the same. We're praying for you. And then excuses about why they couldn't stay on the phone. My mother even asked if I had remembered to buy travel insurance. My brother suggested I hire someone else to deal with it all so I could come home sooner. But I couldn't leave James, not in a place where no one else knew him. I arranged the funeral myself. I stood alone as they lowered my husband into the ground, surrounded not by family but by a handful of coworkers and expats. My parents said the flight was too expensive. My brother had critical work obligations. So it was just me. Me and the sound of soil falling onto the coffin of the man I loved. By the time I finished arranging his affairs, I was financially drained, emotionally shattered, and carrying not just luggage but grief heavy enough to crush me. And yet when I returned home, I still carried this irrational hope that somehow this tragedy would awaken compassion in my family, that they would finally show up for me. But as I learned when I sent that simple text about a ride from the airport, I had been wrong all along. When my plane finally touched down on American soil, I felt like I was running on fumes. 30 hours of travel, 3 countries, no sleep, and a hollow chest where my heart should have been. I had texted my family one last time before landing, hoping against hope someone would reconsider. But the reply came swift and sharp like a slap. We're busy. Try Uber. And then from my mother. Why didn't you plan better? I sat there in my cramped airplane seat, staring at those words, and something inside me shifted. For 35 years, I had excused their absence, rationalized their neglect. But in that moment, I realized I had been waiting for water from a dry well my entire life. Portland International buzzed with its usual noise, families reuniting children, laughing lovers embracing. I stood alone at the baggage carousel watching suitcase after suitcase slide past. Mine were easy to spot, one large black case with my clothes, and two others packed with James's life. His favorite sweater, his running shoes, his journal, the coffee mug he used every morning. Each item I lifted felt heavier than it should, as if grief itself had crept into the seams. My phone buzzed again, another message from Troy. "Seriously, sis, we can't rearrange our schedules last minute. This is why planning exists." And then from Mom. "Your father and I have dinner with the Hendersons tonight. We RSVP'd weeks ago. My dad added only forecast says rain. Drive carefully." Not a single word about how I was, not even a welcome home. As I pushed the cart, one of the wheels jammed, jerking sideways. The top suitcase toppled, burst open, and James's clothes spilled across the polished floor. A blue sweater, his tie from our anniversary dinner, his running shoes. My knees hit the ground as I scrambled to gather them, my vision blurred with tears. "Let me help you, ma'am." A kind voice broke through. An airport worker knelt beside me, her name tag reading Gloria. She had soft eyes lined with years of compassion. "My husband died," I whispered through sobs. "I just buried him in Singapore." Her face softened. She didn't rush me. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just helped me repack James's belongings in silence, then wheeled my cart herself to the rideshare pickup. "Take care of yourself," she said quietly as she squeezed my hand. It was more comfort than my own family had given me in months. The Uber ride cost $78 because of rush hour. The driver, a man named Paul, tried gentle conversation, but I could barely respond. When he pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as when I had left, yet completely foreign. James would never again open that front door, never again complain about the maple tree clogging the gutters. Paul hesitated as he set down my luggage. "Are you sure you're okay? You seem like you might need someone." I forced a smile I didn't feel. "I'll be fine." But as soon as his taillights disappeared, the silence of the house swallowed me whole. The air inside was cold, stale. My mother had promised she would adjust the thermostat before I came back. She hadn't. The fridge was empty except for moldy containers, though my brother had sworn he'd stock it. The mail overflowed untouched. Every little promise broken, again. I was too exhausted to care. I dragged myself upstairs, past the photographs of happier times, past the untouched closet where James's flannel still hung exactly as he'd left it. I curled into an armchair by the window coat still on because the house was freezing. Surrounded by silence, I finally let myself break. When I woke hours later, it was to the sound of dripping water. I stumbled to the kitchen and gasped. A pipe had burst in the ceiling. Water poured down the walls, pooling across the tile, seeping into the floors. My breath fogged in front of me. The house was an icebox. I waded through freezing water to shut off the valve, my fingers burning against the cold metal wheel. It took all my strength, but the damage was already done. The drywall sagged dangerously, the floors warped, water dripped from the light fixtures. The storm outside had worsened. Snow piled on the windowsills. The power flickered. I called an emergency plumber, but they were overwhelmed. The earliest they could come was Tuesday. My kitchen was underwater. My house had no heat. I hadn't eaten in 24 hours. So I called my brother. "Troy, the house is flooded. A pipe burst. I can't stay here, it's not safe. Can I stay with you for a few nights?" There was a long pause. Then actually tonight's bad timing. Lisa and I have clients coming over, and the guest room's full of her crafting stuff. Have you tried Mom and Dad? My chest tightened as I hung up and dialed my parents. "The house is flooded," I said, my voice cracking. "I can't stay here. Could I come stay with you until it's fixed?" My mother sighed. "Oh, honey, you know we'd normally say yes, but we're hosting bridge club tomorrow. And your father's back is acting up. It's just not possible. Can't you get a hotel? You should have insurance." I stood in my freezing, flooded kitchen shoes, soaked body, trembling crackers, my only meal in a day, and realized I was completely alone. I told myself I could manage one night in the house, just one night until I figured something out. But as the storm outside raged, the temperature inside dropped lower and lower. My breath clouded in front of me, my hands went numb, and the power flickered again and again, each time making my chest tighten with dread. Desperation drove me to the basement, hoping I could at least get the furnace running. The stairs were slick with water, but I clung to the railing phone flashlight guiding my steps. Cold water reached my ankles as I waded toward the electrical panel. I reached for the metal box, praying for some miracle, and my foot slipped. The shock slammed into me like lightning. Pain shot up my arm and my body flew backward, my head striking something hard. Darkness swallowed me whole. When I came to, I was sprawled on the wet concrete, my right arm tingling, my temples sticky with blood. Dizzy and shaking, I crawled toward the stairs. Each step was agony. By the time I reached the main floor, I collapsed onto the sofa, my body too weak to move further. My teeth chattered violently. My fingers refused to obey me. Somewhere in the fog of my brain, I knew the signs: hypothermia, but I couldn't muster the strength to care. Then came another sound, a high-pitched beeping that pierced through the haze. The carbon monoxide detector. The heating system must have been damaged by the water. Gas was filling the house. My phone lay just inches away, but it might as well have been miles. My body wouldn't move. My vision tunneled. In those fading moments, a strange calm washed over me. If this was how it ended, at least I'd be with James again. At least the pain would stop. My last memory before slipping under was the pounding on my front door, a voice calling my name, and then nothing. I later learned it was Diane, my neighbor across the street. She'd seen water spilling from under my door and heard the alarm blaring inside. When I didn't answer, she called emergency services. Firefighters broke down the door and found me unconscious, hypothermic, poisoned by carbon monoxide, concussed, shocked, and bleeding. They told me a few more hours would have been too late. The next thing I remember is fluorescent lights above me, the steady beep of hospital machines, and voices around me. Nurses, paramedics, strangers. Strangers who saved my life when my own family couldn't be bothered to check if I made it home safe. I drifted in and out of awareness as they worked warming blankets, oxygen mask stitches for the gash on my temple. A nurse named Sarah held my hand and asked gentle questions. Through half-conscious whispers, I told her everything: James's death, the lonely funeral, my family's cold replies, the flooded house. She listened, really listened, and documented it all. And that was when a local reporter overheard. He was at the hospital covering storm-related injuries. He caught wind of my story: newly widowed woman, abandoned by family, nearly dying alone in her own flooded house. By evening, my tragedy was on the local news. The headline cut like a knife: local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral to near tragedy at home. They even shared screenshots of the family group chat, my simple plea for a ride, my family's dismissive replies. Within hours, the story spread across social media. The hashtag no worries began trending, people sharing their own stories of abandonment when they needed family most. Businesses stepped in. A plumbing company offered free repairs. A restoration service volunteered to fix the water damage. A hotel chain donated a stay while my house was rebuilt. And strangers, neighbors, even people across the city sent messages of kindness and support. Meanwhile, my family watched their indifference play out on the evening news. By the time they rushed into my hospital room, their faces pale. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about appearances. Troy burst in, first stammering, "They're making it sound like we abandoned you." My mother followed, defensive, insisting it was a misrepresentation. My father stood quietly in the corner, unreadable. Not once did they ask how I was. Not once did they apologize. It was all about them, their image, their shame, their discomfort. The days that followed blurred into a strange mixture of recovery and revelation. My body was weak, but my mind was finally waking up. The hospital room became a stage, and my family played their roles with practiced precision. When doctors or nurses entered, my mother's voice softened, her hand clutched mine, as though we were inseparable. Troy leaned forward, phone put away for once, pretending to be the attentive brother. My father stood by the window sighing gravely as though weighed down by concern. But when the staff left, the masks slipped. Troy tapped furiously on his phone, whispering about how the narrative online needed damage control. My mother fussed over how this would look to her bridge club. My father barely spoke at all. Not once did they say, "We're sorry. How can we help you heal?" It was all about perception, about saving face. Then came the morning when Dr. Reynolds entered with my chart. He spoke clearly, directly looking at me rather than them. Mrs. Henderson has experienced significant trauma physically and emotionally. She requires rest, warmth, good nutrition, and most importantly, a low-stress environment. Then his eyes met mine. "What support system do you have in place, Amelia?" I opened my mouth, but Troy jumped in, smiling smoothly. "She has us. We're her family." This whole thing was just a misunderstanding that the media blew out of proportion. I wanted to scream. A misunderstanding I had begged them for help. I had nearly died alone in my own house. And yet they still couldn't see beyond themselves. Before I could answer, a nurse named Jessica stepped in with my medication. She looked me in the eye and asked quietly, "Are you comfortable with this plan? Because there are alternatives if you need them." My mother stiffened. "Alternatives? She belongs with her family." But Jessica didn't look away. "The choice is yours." In that moment, something broke free inside me. For years, I had bent myself into knots to accommodate them, to excuse them, to believe blood meant loyalty. But lying in that bed, stitches in my temple, burns on my hand, grief clawing at my chest, I realized I had a choice. I took a breath steadier than I expected. "I'd like to hear about the alternatives." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Troy's thumbs froze mid-text. My mother's jaw clenched. My father turned from the window at last. "You can't be serious," my mother whispered, her voice sharp with disbelief. "After everything we've done for you?" The words slipped out of me before I could stop them. "What exactly have you done?" And once they were spoken, I didn't want to take them back. I wanted them to hear. I wanted them to feel it. When James was dying, you didn't come. When I buried him alone, you said flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride after 30 hours of travel, you told me to get Uber. When my house flooded, you chose bridge club and client dinners. So please, tell me what you've done that entitles you to control my healing now that people are watching. Troy shot to his feet. "That's completely unfair." "We didn't know how serious." "You didn't ask?" I interrupted. My voice wasn't raised, but it cut like glass. "Not once did any of you ask how I was really doing. Not once did you offer help without excuses. You didn't need the news to tell you I was alone. You chose not to see it." My mother's face flushed crimson. "Your expectations are unrealistic. Families can't drop everything for every little crisis." "Every little crisis," I repeated softly. "Like whether your newly widowed daughter freezes to death in her own home." For the first time, my father spoke. His tone was subdued, almost pleading. "Amelia, grief makes people say things they don't mean. When you're thinking more clearly." "I am thinking clearly," I cut him off. My voice shook, but not with weakness, with strength. "Clearer than I have in years. I see now that I've spent my whole life accepting scraps of attention and calling it love." Jessica adjusted my pillow, her quiet presence a shield. "It took courage to say that," she murmured. But it didn't feel like courage. It felt like finally telling the truth. When I was discharged from the hospital, it wasn't my family who came to get me. It was Diane, the neighbor, who had saved my life by calling 911. She brought me a warm coat, a thermos of soup, and a quiet smile that said more than any rehearsed apology ever could. My parents had offered me a ride, but only after another long lecture about optics and forgiveness. Troy texted me an article about reputational management, as if my near-death experience was some corporate scandal that needed spin. I declined. I didn't need chauffeurs with strings attached. I needed people who showed up because they cared. The hotel chain that had donated a temporary stay welcomed me into a warm, comfortable room with fresh sheets and stocked meals. For the first time in weeks, I slept without shivering. Each morning, a volunteer group checked on me, bringing groceries and asking how I was really doing. Strangers cared for me in ways my own blood never had. Meanwhile, the story kept spreading. No worries became a symbol of resilience and self-worth. People from across the country wrote to me, sharing how they too had begged for love from families who only gave excuses. I wasn't alone anymore. My voice had touched something universal, something raw. And my family. They tried to do damage control. My mother posted on Facebook about misunderstandings. Troy commented under news articles defending our family name. But their words rang hollow. People saw through it. The more they tried to protect their image, the clearer their absence became. One evening, Diane visited me at the hotel with a basket of fresh bread. She sat across from me, hands folded, and said, "Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the family that saves us. Sometimes family is the people who show up when it matters." Her words sank deep. For so long I had carried this wound of not being enough, for my parents not being worth the effort for my brother. But maybe the truth wasn't about me being unworthy. Maybe it was about them being incapable. I began therapy soon after working through years of neglect that I had disguised as family quirks. I started writing again, journaling my pain, my memories of James, my small steps forward. Slowly, the sharp edges of grief softened into something I could carry without breaking. One day, I visited James's grave with a bouquet of daffodils. I told him about everything: the storm, the hospital, the news coverage, even the hashtag. I told him how strangers had become my safety net, how Diane had stepped in when my own blood turned away. And I promised him this, that I would no longer beg for scraps of love from those unwilling to give it. Standing there, I felt both broken and whole. Broken because James was still gone, whole because I was learning that my worth didn't depend on who failed me. My family still tries sometimes to pull me back into their orbit, but I have boundaries now. Boundaries built not from bitterness, but from truth. I answer their calls when I want to. I visit if it feels right, but I no longer twist myself into silence just to keep peace. Because the lesson I learned, nearly frozen, nearly gone, is that survival demands honesty, and love, real love, doesn't make excuses. It shows up. So if you're listening to this story and you've ever felt abandoned by the very people meant to hold you, hear me when I say your value isn't defined by their neglect. Family can be chosen. Safety can come from strangers. And healing begins when you stop waiting for those who never arrive. If my story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to walk away from the people you thought would always be there? Your story matters. You never know who it might save.